G'day, Mark here. Today I want to have a conversation about civilians owning guns, I suppose is what it comes down to. It's a bit more of a conversation to the anti-gun side of the world, people who think that largely guns are bad or evil or dangerous and people shouldn't have them and the world would be better without having guns. And I suppose I would start off with there's some logic to the anti-gun, some of the things that they think, but the majority of the logic has been planted. There's a bit of propaganda, there's a bit of the process of our world that have made guns a very bad thing in their vision, in their perception. But I want to explain a little bit because there is two sides to the story. There is always two sides to the story, and put a bit more of an even perspective, I suppose, what I would like to do. Yes, there's been a lot of propaganda, and there has, be that from sensationalism, from people trying to make money out of the process, and the likes of Hollywood and the likes of the media, be it in propaganda or be it in sensationalism, have made guns a very scary thing to a lot of people. That is the nature of what's happened, some of it through deliberate manipulation and some of it through making more money. It makes it more exciting. But it is a perception rather than a reality in some of those cases. And I suppose I'll go through to try and explain that a little bit more. The first and most foremost thing that people go on about with firearms is in gun violence. Gun death, gun violence. Deaths created by firearms. And yes, if you removed all the firearms from the world, so there was no such thing as a gun anymore, then you couldn't have gun death. So all the gun violence would disappear. It doesn't mean all the violence would disappear, and it's an extremely impractical thought. Even if you did get every legal gun owner to give up every gun they ever had, then you'd only end up with guns in the hands of the bad guys, the people who don't follow the rules, and the controllers. Not an ideal situation. But let's just analyse of course that's not a possible thing to remove all the guns from everywhere. It's that they are all over the world. That's the simple situation. If you went back to 1700 and stopped them from being designed, then okay, you could do that. But of course, that's not realistic. But even let's analyse where actually gun violence is really bad. If you look at it in the fashion, there are cities where literally hundreds or even thousands of people die every year through gun violence. And in that statistic alone, that sounds terrible. So surely those cities would be better off to not have the firearms. Largely, those cities we're talking about do have either illegal ownership of firearms or there is very, very tight controls over firearms. But a statistic that's never mentioned in a public sense is that for every time there is one violent crime happening with a firearm, there is 10, if not 100 times that a firearm is what stopped the violent crime. Most of those aren't reported because just someone having a firearm or showing a firearm or revealing that they do have power of a firearm has stopped a violent crime. That isn't a reported thing. But what is reported, even what is reported, is at least 10 times the number of violent crimes stopped with a firearm than there is actually happens with a firearm. So even in those cities where there's lots of restriction but there's lots of gun violence, there is a much more positive thing to what the firearms are doing to a negative thing. And once again, if you removed all the firearms from the people who illegally have them, then you'd actually create the problem to be a lot worse. And that is happening in some parts of our world, by the way. There is places where the firearms are being removed and then the firearm violence increases because there's no good guys with firearms. A very emotive conversation. I'll move on from that, but there are some real statistics that go the other way. The next thing we'll talk about in firearms is in the way of the hunting side of things. And this is shooting animals and killing animals, and how terrible that is, and we shouldn't do that. Well, of course, our supermarket freezers are full of animals that are killed through, some would say, less humane means. Obviously, there's all sorts of the emotive sides of that sort of stuff. Someone killing Bambi in the forest. There's a lot to that conversation, and there is, yes, ethical hunting that happens, which some would argue is far more ethical and far more humane than what happens in abattoirs. Some would argue the other side. There is the vegan side of the conversation. Why should you eat meat at all? Because why should you kill an animal? Of course, what there's not spoken about there is in the vegan side of things, generally that sort of farming kills a lot more animals than hunting kills in the way of animals. Big complicated conversation to go with that side of things, very emotive situation to go with that side of things. The argument that I suppose in my particular area here in Western Australia, the main hunting that happens over here is pest control or feral animal control. And an awesome, I should say, a very large amount of that happens, that has to happen without the devastation of our local native animals. The feral animals are far more successful at using our country and turning our country into what suits them. So it is actually the recreational hunter that is the largest means of keeping control of that. In just simply a financial sense, if you took all the firearms off them, then you replace it with our government has to deal with that, and that is literally millions and millions of dollars would be involved with it, or devastation of our native fauna and fauna over here. So I get the emotional side of things on the animal side of it, the hunting side of it. There is a big positive attached to it as well. But really, my conversation isn't about the reasons for that I can go through or anyone can go through and justify, and the fact that there's emotional sides of the conversation either side of it. It's more the thought that a firearm is a deadly weapon. And why would anyone want to have a deadly weapon? That comes from the perception that a firearm is a deadly weapon. To be truthful, us in the gun community, in the people who like and use the firearms in all sorts, from shotguns to handguns to rifles to target shooting to hunting to all the rest of it. In some cases, we think of them as just a tool. In some cases, they mean more than that. In some cases, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of resources and time and devotion that have gone into that particular inanimate object we're talking about. The same as a set of golf clubs, the same as a guitar, the same as a painter's palette, the same as a garden or a rose bush or a really nice dress or whatever it is that you have an inanimate object that you put a lot of effort into. That is to a large degree how firearms are seen to someone who's into their firearms and likes their firearms. The deadly weapon side of things is a perception that's put there by you. As for how deadly they are, you can compare. A car is far more deadly than a firearm and can be used in a far more deadly fashion, and we have a far more reckless way of using cars. We drive down highways where they drive towards each other. We drive cars around where pedestrians are. We use cars in an extremely reckless fashion if you consider how we use firearms. Our hospitals and the amount of death that happens inside them through the fact that it is the nature of life and death how our world is. But the statistics are far worse there, or pharmaceutical companies, or processed food. A dessert spoon has killed more people than a firearm, actually, in our world. A little figurative way of putting it, but you get what I'm trying to say. The truth of it is, firearms and the way they're used in a very responsible fashion have very, very low numbers attached to them, even in the way of deaths in the situation that actually happens. I should point out, by the way, one of the statistics that's always used in firearms is including suicide. People who are going to do that to themselves in the desperation of the world they're in find that an easy way out. That shouldn't be the firearm's fault. Although it's probably a fairly effective way of doing things, it's not something that makes the firearm evil for doing that. That's the way out for that person, which is all the horrible things that have happened to put in that situation. But what I'm really trying to get back to is the firearm is not, we don't see it as a violent, horrible, deadly thing at all. It's an object that is actually part of, we use it largely in the firearms industry or the firearms community. We use it as something to better ourselves. And it's, well, like I said, whether that's a guitar or that's a car or a sewing machine or a tennis racket or a set of golf clubs or whatever it is that you use, where that you use that item, that tool, that piece of equipment, that whatever, that instrument, use it to better yourself, to gain a skill, to try and be better at that skill, to be part of a community, to be part of a competition, to be part of the rest of the world, to engage in forms, to try and improve yourself, and to try and get through the daily grind, to get through the yearly grind, the thing that we do when we try and live in this world. We try and make it sensible in a fashion that we can go forward and we can be productive members of our community. That's exactly what we use a firearm for. So that's what a gun is to us. So this is a perception thing, and I think the fear, the propaganda, the sensationalism, all that side of it has certainly taken its toll. And I suppose there is also an agenda that's going on around our world and our world governments to take firearms off people. And I suppose this conversation is to try and say, this is a perception issue we've got. We've got bad press on the firearms. They are inanimate objects, but we can be quite passionate about them in a very constructive fashion. If you really would be interested in being part of finding out more about it, then go along to any gun club and see the people there. This is not heathens with gnarled teeth that are trying to do anything evil at all. Generally, there's a genuine people that get on very nicely, very polite, and very respectful. I would argue that our firearms community has some really high qualities that it could offer the rest of society, in the way of, yes, they are something that you need to use with discipline. A firearm is something that needs to be used with discipline. And learning how to be disciplined about that sort of stuff can follow through into helping everyone, actually. With a firearm, we have some very simple rules. You never point a firearm at something you don't want to put a hole in, and you never put your finger on the trigger until you are ready to be able to put that hole in that thing. But those rules could be used so much more successfully in other parts of our society. So anyway, that's my little bit to go and try and say listen, they're not as scary as you think. And please consider that when people are asking or suggesting that they should be taken away from everybody, please consider that maybe it's a little bit like taking away your golf clubs or your race car or your guitar because someone else doesn't like it or someone else has got a bad perception about it. Anyway guys, that's my video for today. I hope you enjoyed. We'll catch you next time.